And for 26 years, I was the daughter my mother apologized for. Not out loud, of course. My mother, Diane, was too polished for that. She apologized with her eyes. With the way she'd introduce my sister Rachel first at every family gathering. This is Rachel, she just made partner at her law firm. And then gesture toward me almost as an afterthought. And this is Claire. She works with the courts. That was as much detail as she ever gave. She never said I was a public defender. She never said I'd spent 6 years fighting for people who couldn't afford anyone else to fight for them. To my mother, works with the courts sounded almost respectable enough to mention, and vague enough that no one would ask follow-up questions she'd have to answer honestly. Rachel's engagement to Thomas Whitfield changed everything in our family. Thomas came from money, old money, the kind with a family name attached to a wing of a hospital. His parents were exactly the kind of people my mother had spent her whole life trying to look like she belonged around. And so, when Rachel got engaged, my mother transformed. She started using words like impeccable and appropriate in every sentence. She started rehearsing. 2 nights before the rehearsal dinner, she called me into the kitchen. "Claire, I need to talk to you about tomorrow night." "The dinner?" "I already bought a dress, Mom." "It's not about the dress." She sat down across from me, folding her hands the way she did when she was about to say something she'd clearly practiced. "The Whitfields are particular people. Thomas's father is on the board of 2 hospitals. His mother sits on the symphony board. These are people who care about presentation, about pedigree." "Hey," I said slowly. And I just think for tomorrow it would be best if you kept a lower profile. Let Rachel and Thomas have their moment. Don't bring up your job. You know how people react when they hear public defender. They assume you deal with criminals all day. It makes people uncomfortable at dinner parties. Just smile, be polite, and don't embarrass us in front of her in-laws. I sat there for a moment, absorbing it. 26 years, and my mother had never once asked about a case I'd worked on, never once seemed proud that I'd graduated top of my class in law school, never once acknowledged that representing people who had nothing, no money, no power, no one else in their corner was its own kind of hard, its own kind of important. "You want me to be invisible," I said. "I want you to be appropriate," she corrected, like that word made it kinder. I could have argued. I could have reminded her that I hadn't chosen public defense because I couldn't get a real job. I turned down 2 corporate firm offers to do this work. I could have told her that just last month, I'd helped get an 18-year-old kid's case dismissed after proving the arresting officer's report didn't match the body camera footage, that the kid was now back in community college instead of sitting in a cell. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and said, "Fine, Mom. I'll stay quiet." She smiled, relieved, like I just solved a problem for her. "Thank you, sweetheart. I knew you'd understand." The rehearsal dinner was held at a private event space downtown. The kind of venue with low lighting, string quartets, and servers who refilled your water glass before you noticed it was half empty. I arrived in the navy dress I'd bought, hair done, doing everything my mother had asked. Staying quiet, staying small. Rachel looked stunning, glowing in that pre-wedding way. Thomas seemed genuinely kind. Actually, he'd always been polite to me at family functions, asked real questions, seemed to actually listen to the answers. It wasn't him I resented. It was the performance my mother demanded around him. I found a seat near the edge of the room, close enough to be present, far enough to be forgettable. I made small talk with a cousin about nothing. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I said I work in the legal field when someone asked what I did, and let them assume whatever they wanted. Corporate law, maybe something with a nice office and a view. My mother caught my eye once from across the room and gave me a small, approving nod, like I was a dog that had finally learned to sit. I looked away. About 40 minutes into dinner, there was a small commotion near the entrance. A late arrival. I didn't think much of it. Weddings and rehearsal dinners always have someone running behind, some uncle stuck in traffic, some +1 who got the time wrong. Thomas's father, Richard Whitfield, stood up from the head table, beaming. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet someone very important to our family. This is Judge Eleanor Marta. She's been a mentor to Thomas since he was a boy, practically an aunt to him. We're so glad she could make it tonight." The room did that polite ripple of applause people do for esteemed guests. I glanced up out of habit. The word judge always caught my attention, an old professional reflex, and then my stomach dropped. I knew her. Judge Eleanor Marsh wasn't just a judge. She was my judge. She'd presided over 3 of my most difficult cases in the past 2 years, including the one I was proudest of, the wrongful arrest case I'd fought for 8 brutal months, the one that had made the local news when we finally got the charges dropped and the department had to answer for the officer's conduct. She was sharp, exacting, and famously hard to impress. In 2 years she'd given me maybe 3 compliments total, and I treasured every one of them like gold. I sank a little in my chair. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew with absolute certainty what my mother would want in this moment. Silence. Invisibility. Don't let the judge realize her daughter was sitting quietly at the edge of a dinner, being introduced to no one, mentioned to no one. I looked down at my plate and prayed she wouldn't notice me. She noticed me. I watched her eyes sweep across the room as she greeted people near the entrance, polite nods here, warm handshakes there. And then her gaze landed on me and her whole expression shifted. Not confusion. Recognition. Genuine, immediate recognition. Claire. Her voice cut cleanly across the low hum of conversation. Claire Bennett? The room quieted just slightly, the way rooms do when someone important addresses someone unexpected. I stood up, my heart hammering, painfully aware of my mother's eyes locking onto me from across the room. Yes, Your Honor. Hi. Judge Marsh didn't just nod politely and move on. She crossed the room. Actually crossed it, weaving between tables, ignoring the small cluster of people trying to greet her, and pulled me into a hug. A real one. The kind you give someone you respect. I can't believe you're here, she said, holding me by the shoulders afterward, looking at me the way you look at someone you're proud of. Do you know this woman? She said, turning to the table, to Thomas's parents, to my mother who I could see out of the corner of my eye, frozen mid-motion with her wine glass halfway to her lips. This young woman argued one of the most impressive motions I've seen in 15 years on the bench. The Hargrove case, Richard, you remember that story? It was in the paper. Officer falsifies a report, kid's about to go away for something he didn't do, and this woman doesn't just find the inconsistency. She builds an entire cross-examination around it that has the officer contradicting his own sworn statement in open court. I've had attorneys with 20 years of experience who couldn't have pulled that off. Richard Whitfield's eyebrows shot up. That was you? Eleanor mentioned that case to us. I remember thinking it sounded like something out of a legal drama. She's being generous, I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. It was a team effort. It was not, Judge Marsh said firmly, still holding onto my arm like she wasn't done showing me off. Claire runs circles around attorneys twice her age and half her caseload. Do you know what her caseload looks like? She asked the table, though I suspect it was mostly rhetorical. Public defenders in this state carry 2, sometimes 3 times the caseload of private attorneys, for a fraction of the pay, and this woman still shows up more prepared than anyone in my courtroom. I felt my face go hot. Not from embarrassment this time, from something else. Something closer to disbelief. I had spent so many years shrinking myself in rooms like this that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, actually seen by someone whose opinion carried weight. Thomas's mother leaned in. Claire, I had no idea. Diane, she said, turning to my mother, you must be so proud. There was a pause. A beat too long. My mother recovered quickly, the way she always did, sliding the mask back into place. Oh yes, of course. Claire's always been driven. But I saw it. The flicker before the recovery. The panic of being caught having erased her own daughter's accomplishments for the sake of a room full of people she wanted to impress. Judge Marsh, either not noticing or not caring, kept going. Driven doesn't begin to cover it. Diane, you should be shouting this from the rooftops. Do you know how rare it is to find someone who could easily be making 3 times the salary at a private firm and chooses, every single day, to fight for people who have absolutely nothing? That's not just talent. That's character. I don't think I'd ever heard my mother go quiet for that long in my entire life. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange warm blur. People who had barely acknowledged my existence an hour earlier were suddenly asking me questions. Real questions about my work, about the Hargrove case, about what it was like in the courtroom. Rachel caught my eye at one point and mouthed, "I'm so proud of you," with tears actually threatening at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't known either. My mother had made sure of that. Thomas raised his glass at one point and without any prompting said, "I just want to say, I'm marrying into a family with 2 incredible women. Rachel, obviously, but also Claire, who apparently has been quietly changing people's lives this whole time and nobody bothered to tell me." He looked at me. Why did nobody tell me? I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have humiliated my mother in front of everyone, so I just laughed it off. I don't love talking about work at parties, but the truth sat heavier than that joke. The truth was that I'd been told not to talk about it. Told explicitly to make myself small so that my success, my real hard-earned success, wouldn't disrupt the image my mother had built for this family. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, my mother found me getting my coat from the coat check. You could have told me, she said quietly. About the judge. About that case. I tried, Mom. Multiple times, actually. You just never asked. She didn't have a response to that. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother struggle to find words, watched the practice poise crack just slightly. I didn't know it was that impressive, she finally said. It shouldn't have to be impressive for you to be proud of me, I said, and I meant it gently, not cruelly. I needed you to be proud of the work, not the resume version of it that sounds good at dinner parties. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said so softly I almost didn't hear it, I'm sorry, Claire. I think I've been so afraid of how things look that I forgot to notice what they actually are. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't the tearful movie moment reconciliation you'd want if you were writing this story instead of living it. But it was real, and it was the first time in 26 years my mother had admitted out loud that she'd been wrong about me. Rachel's wedding 3 weeks later was beautiful. And this time when people asked what I did, my mother answered before I could. My daughter Claire, she said, and I watched her take a breath before continuing like she was choosing deliberately to say the thing she used to avoid, is a public defender. She fights for people nobody else will fight for. I'm incredibly proud of her. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody clapped. No judge walked in to back her up this time. It was just my mother finally saying the truth out loud without being prompted, without an audience that demanded it. Sometimes that's how healing actually happens. Not in one grand cinematic moment, but in the choice to keep saying the true thing quietly dinner after dinner, until it becomes the only version of the story you tell.